Welcome to the Holy Post. It's been a week since the election, and why Americans voted to send Donald Trump back to the White House is beginning to come into focus. The entire Holy Post team is here today. Phil, Kaitlyn, Esau, and myself are all going to talk about why Trump won and how Harris lost. Was it the economy? Was it racism and misogyny? Was it identity politics or disinformation in the media? We all have a theory. And then after that, New York Times columnist and Holy Post regular David French talks to me about his take on the election. He explains why Kamala Harris's decision to focus on abortion backfired and why January 6th did not disqualify Trump for most Americans. Before we jump into the show, a quick announcement about our next Holy Post event, which is just a few days away, and tickets are still available. Kaitlyn and I are going to be in Long Beach, California on Monday, November 18th, and we'll be joined by Holy Post pundit and president of the Fuller Youth Institute, Kara Powell. We're going to have a spirited conversation about current events, the latest research about young adults and young people in the church, and Q&A with the audience. It's also a great chance for you to meet other Holy Posters in your area. So for tickets, go to holypost.com/events. Again, that's holypost.com/events. Here is episode 643.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Kaitlyn.
This episode is sponsored by Glorify, the #1 Christian Daily Devotional App. If you're like me, you'd probably love to start your day in the Bible, but you're never sure where to start or what to read. You should try Glorify, the #1 Christian Daily Devotional App. Start your morning with a daily Bible passage, a short devotional, and then an immersive experience called Daily Walk with God. If you need a break in the middle of your day, try one of Glorify's guided meditations or listen to their curated playlist of worship songs. At the end of the day, try a sleep meditation to calm yourself down and forget all about what someone just said about you on Twitter. Visit glorifyapp.com/holypost right now to download the Glorify app. That's glorify-app.com/holypost to download the Glorify app for free. glorify-app.com/holypost. This episode of the Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full-body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode. Hey there, this is Phil Vischer. Welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. I'm here with a bevy of personalities. I don't know if I've ever used the word bevy on the podcast before, but I'm going to try to work it in every week going forward. A bevy of personalities. Everybody's here. We got Kaitlyn Shess. Hi, Kaitlyn.
Hi, Phil.
We got Rocky Mountain Skye. That's what he's named himself for this show. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil. It's because I'm in the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, where are you, Skye?
I'm in Banff, Canada. I hightailed it up here as soon as the election results came out.
Yeah.
And
they're coming. They're looking for you. They're sending the National Guard to find you.
He's off the grid.
Yeah, and we have Esau McCauley. Hi, Esau.
Thank you. It's like the full Avengers. We're all in one place at one
know.
time, at least on the internet.
I had to assemble the Avengers because I don't know if anyone's been paying attention to the news, but it's been a week since we recorded, and stuff went down last week. Stuff went down. There was an election. I don't know if you've all looked it up to see how it turned out. Have you? But Donald Trump won. That's just spoiler alert if you weren't paying attention, if you didn't watch Saturday Night Live, where the whole cast tried to kiss up to him in the cold open so that he wouldn't put them on his enemies list. It was quite amusing. Donald Trump won, and that's part of the news. The other part of the news is how thoroughly he won. So just to run through some of what we learned last week before we get into the concise and incisive commentary on what it means. That's why you guys are here, for the what does it mean? Mm-hmm. Okay. Here's what we learned. The facts that must be faced. And this is according to a very liberal columnist, Roy, R-U-I, Texiera, who writes as the Liberal Patriot. He says the Democrats really, this is the painful reality, the Democrats really are no longer the party of the common man and woman. The priorities and values that dominate the party today are instead those of educated liberal America. His main point is the Democratic coalition shattered into pieces last week. Trump not only won, he won fairly easily, carrying all 7 swing states, and much to Democrats' shock, the national popular vote. And then he dives into some demographic comparisons between this election and 4 years ago using the Associated Press VoteCast data. So he looks at the gender gap. Contrary to much pre-election discussion, Harris's margin among women was actually less than Biden's in 2020. The margin between men and women was 7 points for Harris versus 12 points for Biden. So Harris got less support from women. Women under 30 supported Biden by 30 points beyond Trump in 2020, but supported Harris by just 18 points this time. A 14-point shift towards Trump among women under 30. Kaitlyn, are you a woman? Did you turn 30 recently? You turned 30 did. Recently. I thought I remembered that. Okay.
Not a woman under 30.
So we don't...
You nailed that one, Phil.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have friends, but no, not a woman under 30.
So we can't ask you what this means because you left that.
I have ideas.
You left that cohort. Then there's the non-white vote, and this is where people start to get really, really nervous. Among all non-whites, Harris carried them by 35 points compared to Biden's 48-point margin in 2020. Among black voters, Harris's margin was 67 points compared to 83 points for Biden in 2020. Among Latinos, the Democratic margin was cut in half, plunging to 14 points compared to 28-point margin for Biden. Trump got 42% of the Hispanic vote and 47% among Hispanic men. And people have pointed out the kind of with amazement that the man who ran on mass deportations got almost half, got more Latino support than any Republican presidential candidate has ever gotten. Trump dramatically widened his advantage among the working class, the non-college educated class, tripling his margin from 4 points in 2020 to 12 points in this election. The deficit among non-white working class voters, he compressed it from 48 points in 2020 to 33 points this election. Comparing that margin, this is where it gets really stunning. Obama in 2012 carried the non-white working class vote by a 67-point margin. So the Democrats have had their margin among non-white working class more than cut in half over the last 12 years. So he says it's time to face the fact that the GOP has become the party of America's working class. And then he goes to the youth vote. Democrat support among voters under 30 collapsed from a 25-point advantage in 2020 to a mere 6-point advantage in 2024, including among voters 30 to 44, where Harris's advantage over Trump was only 4 points, which seems to indicate that the idea that the next generation was going to turn America permanently progressive and liberal may need to be rethought. Skye.
Can I throw a few more stats in here that you
Yeah.
Is there going to be a quiz at the end of this? Because I'm under a mountain of
This is a
stats.
lot.
Can we have like one or two more stats before? Because I got lost halfway through. But go ahead.
I know that was a lot of numbers, but here's this very simple stat that I think encapsulates the whole mess. Trump increased his margin among voters in 48 out of 50 states compared to 2020.
Wow.
And he increased his margin with basically every demographic. So Trump made major gains in places like New York City, in very blue states like New Jersey and Illinois. He expanded his voter base everywhere among every demographic. And that is amazing.
So can we oversimplify and simply say it was the economy, stupid? I know that's part of it. Do we have to go further than that?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
I'm working on a piece right now. We'll see if it ever sees the light of day. And it has actually, I can just talk about the black vote very quickly, that over actually the last 5 elections from Obama in 2008 to 12 to 16 to 20, that the Democratic percentage of the black vote has declined over 5 election cycles. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it would be overly simplistic to think that this was simply the result of one actual election. I think there's wider trends that are leading to shifts in the American voter.
Tell me if you agree with this, Esau, from your experience. I read a piece wondering if this was the death of identity politics, and that
No, that's
wasn't done yet.
That's not a serious statement, because Trump ran on identity politics. Like that's
okay.
The idea.
But what was the identity? Is it the identity just shifting to class rather than race?
There was some. So I will speak very briefly. The idea that there wasn't this kind of pushback on I am white. It's not wrong to be white. I can be white and proud. Like there was a certain amount of white working class identity that Trump appealed to. That wasn't the only thing, right? He obviously appealed to other people. But the idea that there was no identity politics involved, or even the fact that he said, these people are your enemies, right? And it wasn't just class, it was racialized people. And so the idea there was no identity politics involved in the Trump campaign, it's just not a serious argument. It's not a serious argument. Because they had blacks for Trump. So if you had blacks for Trump, then that's actually an identity. And the whole point is Trump was reaching out to the black vote. Yeah. And so what they might be saying is the idea that only Democrats are talking about identity, it may have changed, but the idea there's no identity politics wasn't true.
Okay. I heard it. Hang on. I wanted to say something else before you interrupted me in the first place. I heard it suggested that the amount of social pressure, if you grow up in a Latino community or if you grow up in an African-American community, the amount of social pressure to vote Democrat is decreasing as more people who are voting for economic reasons, not for, historic or racial reasons. Agree? Disagree? Social pressure decreasing?
I think social cohesion is decreasing. I don't think the social pressure is at all decreasing. And also, it is important to note that on the stuff that I read, that the black vote for Harris ended up being 87% versus 13%. So 87% is still a ridiculously high number. It's down from the 95% that was Obama, but 87 is still particularly high. I'm not making a comment one way or the other. So the idea that this is all breaking down. And I think one of the issues is that we often collapse black into Latino into Asian, but the Latino vote has never been exactly the same as the black vote. Right. And so asking if all people of color are voting one way or the other is shifting. And so I would say there's still an overwhelming black support for the Democratic Party, but there is a decades-long verbalized dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party amongst the black vote, even if they continue to vote for the Democratic Party. And you've seen some people not vote, and some people who have voted for third party, and some people who've obviously voted for Trump.
Yeah. Skye?
Okay, first of all, there is no Latino vote. I think that's just, it's an artificial category that's been created because, Cubans in South Florida, Cuban Americans in South Florida vote very differently than Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia or Mexicans in Southern California. And then there's generational differences based on when, how long those families or citizens have been in this country. It's just such a diverse group. And I think part of what the loss of identity politics, I'm using air quotes, is really both parties, especially the Democratic Party, coming to realize that the Latino vote is an artificial category. And the diversity of that vote is expressing itself. And you can't just lump everybody into one ethnic category and say the majority of these people are all going to vote the same way. That's where I think we're losing the identity politics categories from previous cycles.
Okay. Kaitlyn, who's right and who's wrong?
I'm sure that both Esau and Skye are right and wrong in different ways. But I think when I hear all
you
those
could
statistics...
run for office with an answer like that.
I'm sure we all are. Everyone on this podcast right about some things, wrong about other things. When I hear all those statistics, I think, and other people have said this as well, but it's not just like a messaging problem for the Democratic Party. It is a larger problem of kind of how typically more left-leaning folks have understood how to think about and talk about social problems, not only in this kind of grouping way, right? Lots of people have said, you've just assumed some of these groups are on your side without paying any attention to how far left you've gone on some social issues that actually really matter to them, that they're more conservative on, and they're bothered by the way you're talking about sexuality, gender issues, abortion, et cetera. But I think a deeper messaging and like real content problem is that some of the ways that the Democratic Party, more left-leaning folks have learned to talk about social issues is to recognize the structural problems, which is really important, but to leave people feeling like they're being spoken to in a paternalistic way and they're not being given any sense of agency. So it's like the problems are outside of you. You have no ability to solve them. We will come and kind of fix them for you, but you don't have any role to play in this, which has led to a lack of listening to people and what they actually want and need, because the assumption is, this is the messaging I heard on Twitter over the last few days, like, well, we are addressing the actual needs and problems of the white working class, of Black voters, of Latino voters. They don't see it, but we know what they need, which is so paternalistic and not helping any of those relationships, but also exposes this deeper issue of a lot of the messaging on the Republican side for the last couple cycles has been a reclaiming of agency. Like, we will create the conditions where you can live the kind of life you want to live. You have a say in this. Join our movement. Like, we will give you a sense of your place in the world and real agency you have to do something. And if the response to that is, Trump is the threat, we will save you, but also the problems that you face are entirely structural and you have no agency to address them at all, it's demoralizing. It doesn't produce the kind of sense of identity, community, and agency that gets people involved in politics. And I'm especially thinking when you're listing some of those numbers of different racial groups, but also for women. Like, I have had conversations with many college-age women over the last year who are really frustrated by some of the messaging that sort of assumes you need to be saved and you don't have any agency in the world that you can exert. And they're frustrated. And it makes them, I think, overly frustrated towards a feminist agenda. I can't tell you how many young women in the last year I've heard say, I'm not a feminist, I don't need anyone to save me, which is not a proper understanding of like feminism in its truest form, but it speaks to a concern that says that some of the media I'm consuming, some of the political messaging I'm consuming is treating me like a victim, and I don't feel like a victim. I feel like I have agency in the world, and I want people who are saying, we want to create better conditions for you to create with other people the kind of life and community you want to live in, not someone that says, trust us, we'll figure this out for you, we'll fix it for you. You're kind of poor and downtrodden and you need our help to fix things.
Esau, I think you have something that you would like to say.
No, I would just think, man, I'm trying to be diplomatic out in these streets. I think that the Democratic Party, one of the things that when I was coming up into evangelicalism, I'll say really briefly, was the way that I was spoken to, and it was very condescending from Republicans. I'm gonna be honest, and like, if you are a Christian, you must do A, B, and C. And I'm like, bro, I know enough history to understand like the complicity of a bunch of people and a bunch of stuff. So allow me to discern and treat me like I'm like in ways that intellectually serious. And I will say that same condescending lecturing tone has marked a lot of kind of white liberal discourse around race and justice. And the idea that the black Christian political thought is more than liberal policies dipped in chocolate. I'll say that as plainly as I possibly can. And the idea that...
that's one of my favorite snacks from Trader Joe's.
And the idea that our faith is never going to challenge the liberal consensus, And that as important as racial justice is, it's central to like what we need to flourish. He's not the only thing that we care about. And the idea is that because we're pro-social justice around police violence and those kinds of things, you should just be quiet, or anything else that you say or any other concerns that you have are secondary to that. And I want to say, for me, it was just like, respect me enough to allow me to have complicated political opinions that don't slide into one or the other. And I just got really tired of people not understanding that I could disagree with MAGA and disagree with them.
Yeah.
And that was the part that I found really frustrating during this style lecture cycle. And I'm just like, stop lecturing me. I'm like, and so those things were just frustrating.
I've got an interesting quote from Washington Post columnist Charles Lane. All the Washington Post columnists were asked to comment on what we've learned from the election. Charles Lane said, Democrats have been acting like the proverbial American tourist in France, trying to get their point across by shouting louder in a language only they understand.
Pretty good.
And there was, did you see the survey that Latino voters were less likely to vote for a candidate that used the term Latinx?
Yeah.
You know, so some of the coded language that we've been told, you can't say this now, you need to say this. Even some of the people it applies to are saying, I don't like that. I'm not with that. If you were a candidate that used that term, you lost Latino voters.
Okay. Can I jump in here for a second? Because we've been talking, and most of the commentary coming out of this election has been talking about what's wrong with the Democratic Party. And I agree with all this stuff. It's patronizing, it's condescending, it's too woke, it's all that garbage. 100%.
Well, I wouldn't say too woke, but go ahead.
Okay, well, all right.
I will resist the colonization of Black language until I die.
Yes, right. I mean, that word has a better origin than its current usage, for sure.
If we put it in air quotes, can we say that? Because
no.
We can't even.
But go ahead.
Anyway, all of that critique I tend to agree with about the Democratic failure. But what people are not talking about is, why is Trump so appealing, and why was he able to expand his appeal so dramatically? And I think there's more to it than just the Democratic Party is driving people away.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues that no one's really talking about is what I call the Meatloaf Delusion.
Ooh. Oh, here we go.
Yeah. Here we go.
Kaitlyn.
I'm talking about
This is a book coming. IVP, Brazos, heads up.
You remember Meatloaf, the singer, the rock pop singer? Okay.
Yeah.
Kaitlyn doesn't.
Kaitlyn, no.
His biggest hit back in the 90s was "I Will Do Anything for Love, But I Won't Do That."
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
And I think you don't know that one, Esau?
Anything for love.
Yeah.
You keep finish.
That wasn't it.
What is that?
Okay.
That's a different one.
That's the mystery.
The song doesn't answer the question.
The song, he goes on and on and on and on. I'll do anything for love. I'll do anything for love. I'll do anything for love, but I won't do that. And it's really mysterious, right? Yeah. So I think a lot of Americans on the left in particular, and you saw this in 2016, and we definitely saw it this year, a lot of people believed that Americans, when they go in to vote, they will do anything for lower prices. They don't like inflation. There's a lot of economic interest, but they believe that they won't vote for somebody who is anti-democratic, who's an autocrat, who's fascist light. They won't vote for Donald Trump. That was the theory in 2016, and they, to their shock, realized, oh my gosh, enough Americans will vote for this guy that he at least won the Electoral College. And I think they were playing the same game. Kamala Harris was making a big push at the end of her campaign about how terrible Trump is, how dangerous he is, how anti-democratic he is, how anti-constitutional he is, how fascist he is, how authoritarian he is. And Americans walked into the voting booth and basically said, we'll do anything for lower prices, including vote for that guy. So the I'll do anything, but I won't vote for Trump theory got obliterated. And I think one of the big takeaways I'm getting from this election is similar to what I got in 2016. In 2016, a lot of evangelicals were shocked at the white evangelical support for Trump. A lot of evangelical leaders were shocked by that. And what they realized is we had a crisis of discipleship, where evangelical leaders felt one way, but their flocks voted another way. And this year, what we're seeing is there's a lot of elites in America who care about the Constitution and care about democracy and care about these norms, and most Americans don't. And it's a crisis of citizenship, where we have people who just don't care enough to not elect Donald Trump.
Okay. I feel like you just insulted most Americans with a
Yeah, I
fairly
did.
broad brush. And I'm going to push back on that. And here's why. Okay. First of all, I push back on some people, particularly kind of the talking head activist class that have said, this is proof that America is hopelessly racist and hopelessly misogynistic. No, I don't think it's that. I believe this is proof, and you all can disagree with me. I believe it is proof that low information voters play a huge role in presidential elections that they do not play in midterms. And one of the reasons the Democrats were so encouraged after 2022 was that they won races they weren't supposed to win, and there was no blue wave, and there were special elections, and they won all the special elections. And those are midterms and special elections that have very low voter turnout. And it's the people who keep up with everything that come out and vote in those. In presidential elections, everybody comes out, and most people don't follow politics. So low information voters, I believe, decided the election and voted mostly on vibes and sound bites and the view of the status quo as being bad and needing change. And I'm not done yet, Esau McCauley. You'll get your chance.
I didn't say anything.
You didn't? Oh, was that Skye? Did you say something?
I didn't say anything.
Somebody made a noise. Okay.
In the black church, we amen while you speaking. So I'm like, cook. So I'm encouraging you. There we go.
Oh, okay, thank you. I need subtitles so I know when you said amen. Low information voters are more susceptible to misinformation since they're less likely to hear counter opinions. They're less likely to hear both sides of an argument because they just don't get that much information. And we have data to support that because Ipsos did a study on the link between media consumption and public opinion and discovered, among other things, that there was a very high likelihood of people believing factually untrue statements that you could predict based on what news they watched. And that, for example, the statement, the U.S. stock market is at or near all-time highs, which is a true statement. People who watch Fox News and listen to conservative media were the most likely to say that's not true. Violent crime rates are at or near all-time highs in most major American cities. That is a false statement. They're actually near historical lows. But Fox News and conservative media listeners were most likely to say that is absolutely true. Violent crime is at all-time or near all-time highs. Over the last few months, unauthorized border crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border are at or near the lowest level in the last few years. Again, Fox News folks are most likely to say that's not true, and it is true. So what we have, what I viewed this whole election as was a triumph of disinformation, that migrant crime is exploding. We have to shut down the border. Migrants are eating our pets. We have to shut down the border. And we need mass deportations. That inflation is high and running away. And so and it's Biden's fault. Biden made eggs double in price, not bird flu that required us to call about 10 million chickens. No, it wasn't that. It was Biden and Trump. Like, the president can't control prices because we're not a communist country. And yet we like the idea that he can. And Trump told a lot of people, in fact, he said flat out, he's going to slash prices. Trump is going to slash prices. And this is my favorite promise that Trump made. You want to hear my favorite promise that Trump made in this election cycle? He said, every American family will flourish. Everyone. Wow. Every single American family is going to flourish.
Phil.
And there are people who say, hey, that's cool. That sounds great. I'm voting for this guy.
I think there's one problem with your theory that it's just low information voters.
No, there isn't. No, there isn't, Skye.
And the problem is that even when voters are presented the truth, most of them don't believe it.
How do you know?
Because we saw this after the 2020 election when Trump pushed the big lie, and many outlets, including Fox News, eventually came around and had to, because they were sued and had to pay out $800 million. 70% of Republican voters still believe the 2020 election was stolen, despite the fact that they have had no proof of that. When people are presented with facts they don't like, they don't believe them. And so I agree we have a massive information problem in our media, but it's also because people latch onto the facts they want to be true, not the ones they're told are true. And we self-select for the facts that validate the view we already want to have. So people were predisposed to want Donald Trump, and then they chose the facts that back that up. And when they encounter facts that didn't, they said it's fake news and they dismissed it.
But more people chose Donald Trump than 4 years ago.
Because they want him.
So one thing that I think that often gets happened, both of y'all did this, maybe we have a civil war here in the Holy Post, is we just dismiss racism and sexism as just being, of course, 48 or 52% of America isn't racist. And when people say stuff like that, I want to make sure, because this is going to get taken out of context. Let me say this well. When we talk about racism, we think of the Klan. And so no one thinks that like 52% or 60% of America wants to join the Ku Klux Klan. The question is, do we have racial bias? Are we apt to believe stereotypes? And so are we apt to believe things about immigrants that we wouldn't believe about other people? And so the question is America racist? Is the wrong question. Are we susceptible to racialized stereotyping in our advertising? Are we susceptible to gendered stereotyping? And in that sense, racialized tropes and gendered tropes have never been disqualifying in American politics. The idea that if I say something racist, I am therefore going to lose the election has never been the case. And so when we talk about, we know that race and gender weren't factors because we can't say that this many people in America are racist. What we're actually saying is not that percentage of America is not utterly racist. But even you talk about within ethnic minority groups, there can be like racial biases, stereotypes. And so I think we have to be really careful when we say race and gender play zero part in it or not a significant part in it.
Esau.
And so, yes, go ahead.
I didn't say that. I didn't say race and gender plays. I don't believe that this was proof that America is hopelessly racist and misogynistic.
That's a very low bar is what I was trying to say. That's a very low bar. Hopelessly.
I think a better way to put it is maybe the evidence will come out, but I don't see the evidence yet that racism or misogyny were dispositive to the outcome of this election. They no doubt played a role. You can't say it didn't because it's 300 million people. Worse. Yes, I think that we could say that Biden would have done where he was polling much worse before he dropped out of the race than Harris ended up doing. So I think racism and misogyny no doubt had a role. I don't know if they were dispositive to the outcome.
I didn't claim it was dispositive. I'm just saying that there's a soup of things. And I think that what we have to do as Christians is to have as the bar actual holiness, not am I a racist? And so and then we define racist as articulated racial hierarchy that we say out loud versus the sinful racial biases that we may continue to carry in our lives that all of us need to repent of. And so as Christians, we need to say, as we think about how these things influence us, are racial tropes still effective in American politics? And the answer to that question to me is clearly yes. And so and when people ask, and the part that frustrates me about this is say, are you saying that all of America is racist? And that is such a low bar. It's such a low bar. And what I'm asking us to think about is why were certain kinds of things actually the kinds of stuff we can dismiss? So you might say, I don't believe all of that stuff about immigrants, but that didn't actually influence how I voted. And why doesn't that influence how I vote? And why is it that the economy is the most important thing? I think if we actually learn one thing from this election is the God of America is money. And I do think that's something that Christians ought to think about. I do think that the economy had a significant role in the election, so much so that we ignored other things that we already saw. And so if you're asking me, what does it mean for a pastor or a clergy person? That mammon, that money has a bigger influence on American decision making than we might want to admit. And materialism then is probably running rampant in our churches. And if you want to get people upset, you come for their money. And so that's something I think that we learned from this election.
Yeah. Kaitlyn, would you like to add anything? I agree with you, Esau. Macaulay, I agree with you. Kaitlyn, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, and this is really related to what Esau just said, but I think we have to be able to say both that it is unfair and it is unhelpful in our communities to take everything we might know about a candidate and assume that the person who voted for that candidate was aware of those things and approving of those things. There's like a pastoral concern there to say, like, I know lots of people who voted for Trump and I disagree with their decision, but I don't think they knew some of the things that I know, and I don't believe them to have some of the biases that maybe other Trump voters had. So there's like a pastoral concern to your point, Phil, of don't use the outcome of this election or the way you know people voted to just sort of basket of deplorables them. Like, just throw them in a category of you're racist, sexist, horrible person, and very importantly, irredeemable. I saw a lot of folks on Twitter in the last week basically saying the outcome of this election told me that anyone I know, I saw a tweet that said exactly this, anyone I know that voted for Trump, to me, is essentially not human. Like, they have no empathy. It's impossible to save them. So that's a real mentality that's happening that I think we have to hold back against, not only because I just don't think that's actually how the voting happened. I don't think everyone who voted for Trump had everything I know about Trump in mind or loved those things. But also it's unhelpful from a Christian perspective of, I don't believe people are unredeemable. I don't believe that there are people that are so far gone the Holy Spirit cannot convict and change and work in. On the other hand, then, as Esau has said, we have to say, especially for people who are listening, who are like, I don't want to believe that everyone in my community that voted for Trump is racist, sexist, horrible. I do want to mourn deeply that we live in a country that said that these are not disqualifying factors for a candidate. Someone who has said racist, xenophobic things, someone who has openly acknowledged multiple times sexually assaulting women. Like, we should be able to say it's horrifying that those are not disqualifying things. It's horrifying that whether that was covered up or there was disinformation or many people who knew it and sort of said, but the policy matters. All of that is deeply lamentable and we should lament it. And I think the task for a lot of Christians, especially immediately post-election, there's been a lot of calls to like, get your resources together, get your energy together, let's advocate, and I think the Christian response is to say there is a time for that, but it is not at all wrong to spend some time immediately after the election grieving. And my friend, wonderful pastor Tyler Burns has said, like, where we often go most wrong in our responses to these kinds of things is that we didn't grieve first. We moved to action so quickly, it hardened our hearts. We weren't able to actually have relationship or compassion for people who thought about this issue differently. And it's not just that it's hard by itself. It is hard by itself to seek common ground across great political difference, to have conversations with people that you believe have really grievous, really evil political opinions. That's hard anyway. It's harder if you haven't first just lamented the fact that this is true or grieved the relationships you have where you think you're captive to something, and that I just first want to grieve that that's happening to you.
I think Kaitlyn more eloquently articulated what I was trying to say earlier, and that was, in 2016, a lot of evangelical leaders were shocked that Trump's character, which was well known and all the horrible things he said and about women and other races, and that wasn't disqualifying for evangelicals to vote for him. That was the shock in 2016. And I think the shock in 2024 is a lot of people thought that what Trump did on January 6th, whether you thought he incited the riot or not, the fact was he was the sitting president of the United States who sat back and did nothing as a mob attacked Congress. And he forfeited his oath to protect the Constitution, that enough Americans thought that wasn't disqualifying, and they voted for him anyway. Because, to Esau's point, they cared about money, they cared about inflation, they cared about the economy. And for me, in both those cases, the real failure was not a failure of the voters. It was a failure of their leaders. The white evangelical church has failed to disciple its people, to care about character. And what we saw in 2024 was a failure of our political leaders. The Republican Party could have been done with Trump in 2021 when they impeached him after January 6th, but they didn't vote to convict him. They could have barred him from running for re-election in the primaries, but they didn't. And 51% of Americans said, we don't care. We will vote for him anyway. And it fulfills what the founders knew about human nature. And that is, most people, when given the choice, will pick an authoritarian leader. And they tried to put things in place, as flawed as that generation was and had massive blind spots. They understood you need to have institutional things in place to prevent authoritarian leaders from being an option for the American people. Okay. We have taken away those barriers, and here we are.
Okay. I got to move on. Last month at his Madison Square Garden rally in New York, Trump said, on day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history. When the results of the election were clear to me, I kind of felt like the sky had just darkened. And this is why, that something wicked was coming. Some of his staff have been putting together plans for how you do mass scale deportations. So what can and can't he do? Trump can direct his administration to begin the effort the minute he arrives in office. It's much more complicated, though, to actually deport nearly 11 million people who are believed to be in the United States illegally. That would require a huge trained law enforcement force, massive detention facilities, airplanes to move people, and nations willing to accept them back. For example, Venezuela will not accept any deportations from the U.S. So all the Venezuelan folks that we want to send back, we can't. Trump has said he would invoke the Alien Enemies Act. That rarely used 1798 law allows the president to deport anyone who is not a citizen and is from a country with which there is a declared war or a threatened or attempted, quote, invasion or predatory incursion. So if you wonder why so many people have been talking about the invasion at the southern border, it's at least partly because that terminology can trigger the 1798 Alien Enemies Act. Trump has spoken about deploying the National Guard, which can be activated on orders from a governor. Trump advisor Stephen Miller said sympathetic GOP governors could send their own troops to nearby states that refuse to participate. Stephen Miller was just named into the administration about 3 or 4 hours ago. So he will be at Trump's, he was there at Trump's side. He was one of the champions of the family separation policy in the prior term. Asked about the cost of the plan, which has been estimated by some that it could be as much as $90 billion a year, Trump simply said it's not a question of price tag. A bunch of Christian organizations that work with refugees and immigrants are mobilizing. Global Refuge, the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, says if Trump carries out his plans, by the start of 2025, about 1 in 12 U.S. residents and nearly 1 in 3 Latino residents could be impacted by the mass deportations, either because of their legal status or that of someone in their household. IAS, a Jewish nonprofit that works with refugees, said if the mass deportation articulated throughout the campaign season is implemented, it would tear families, communities, and the American economy apart. The solution to the disorder at the border is to prioritize comprehensive immigration reform that updates our antiquated immigration laws while protecting people who need refuge. Faith in Action, another immigrant justice group, said the moment calls us to take immediate action to protect the communities targeted through this campaign and during the prior Trump administration. We remain committed to providing resources, support, and training to empower people to know their rights and stand firm against attempts to undermine their power. World Relief is speaking out against it. Matthew Soren's, our buddy, pointed out that according to Lifeway research, 71% of evangelicals agree the U.S. has a moral responsibility to accept refugees. 75% of evangelicals would like to see some pathway to citizenship for at least some of the illegal aliens already in the country. The Jesuit Refugee Service said Trump's 2024 campaign rhetoric in his previous term had harmed forcibly displaced people. They believe to welcome and serve migrants is an obligation for Catholics. Some Catholic ministries at the border have been targeted because of their support for immigrants. So Christians are activating, which is encouraging to me. The lot of Christian groups are activating and saying, we are going to file lawsuits. We are going to tell people what their rights are. We're going to do whatever we can. Tom Homan was just named the border czar, or the king of deportations would be another way. He was asked on 60 Minutes last Sunday or two weeks ago how you're going to split up families if you start deportations, because quite often the kids are U.S. citizens. If the kids were born in the U.S., they're U.S. citizens. You can't deport U.S. citizens. So what, you send their parents home? And his response was, I'm sure they'll opt to all be deported together to go back to Venezuela or another country where their kids won't be safe. So, guys, what can we do besides pray and have Matthew Soren's on the show to talk about the issues?
Who wants to go first? Part of the problem here, and Kaitlyn and I were down at the border a little over a year ago and met with folks on both sides who are dealing with this very broken system. somebody who's in this country who crosses the border and seeks asylum, legally speaking, is not here illegally, and they are not here undocumented because they're following U.S. law. You can argue the law is broken, and I think it is, but it's not technically illegal. So it's unclear who exactly it is the Trump administration is seeking to deport. Is it purely, legally speaking, those who are undocumented, or does he want to go after the millions of people who've come in recent years claiming asylum, who are documented, but their case for asylum hasn't yet been adjudicated? And many of those claims may prove to be, invalid, but they're not here illegally. So that's where I think it gets really, really messy. I mean, there's many places where it gets messy, and I don't know how you begin to fix this retroactively. I think you can fix it going forward, which is what the legislation earlier this year was trying to do. But looking back, it's really hard to clean up.
It's really hard to clean up, but Tom Homan said at the RNC convention that they would deport all 10 million people that came during the Biden administration.
But they're here legally, so the courts are going to have to intervene.
They'll try to change the rules. Esau, help me.
I'm sorry to be the historian, but in the United States, they did the exact same thing during phases of anti-Asian immigration. They did it to the Japanese, they did it to the Chinese. Actually, before they did it to the Irish. The political move of you are struggling economically because it's the foreigner that I can identify. They did it to the Catholics. And so this is kind of a tradition. This has actually been politically effective. And so I don't know the policy move, but I do know to say that what Christians have to always do is resist dehumanization. That the people who we see aren't just our economic competitors. They're persons made in the image of God. And as persons who are made in the image of God, they deserve our empathy, our respect, and our charity. And that's one of those things. And in order to, and the only way that you can do that, you continue to see that person as a person. And I think the dehumanization motivated by economic gain is something that is ultimately politically effective. And we're seeing it, or we saw it in this particular election. And part of what it means to be a Christian in this age is to resist that dehumanization. And I think that as a Christian, I think it's beyond maybe the responsibility of 90% of American Christians to have a comprehensive, logical immigration policy that we just made up on our own. Mm-hmm. But we can say that we can call upon our governmental leaders to do something that we would recognize as humane and just. And we know what is inhumane and unjust on the face of it. And not have to be a policy expert to know you shouldn't separate families, right? That's not a politically nuanced take, but it's something that I think that we can agree on as Christians.
Yeah. Kaitlyn, last word.
Well, I was just going to say 2 levels to this. One is, I think it's really important to say whether you supported our incoming president or not, he has made promises to protect Christians, to be the best kind of Christian representation. He's made all these claims to be the one the evangelicals love, the protecting Christians guy. I think it's time, whether you were supportive of him or not, to say okay, I am a Christian. You've claimed to be for Christians. I'm going to be a part of communities that tell you very loudly what Christians care about. And to Esau's point, there's room for people who have detailed policy knowledge to kind of flesh out what that means. But I think it behooves all Christians to say, Scripture teaches that nations are judged by how they treat foreigners. And there are varieties of examples throughout Scripture of ways that are mistreatment and ways that are positive treatment that include caring for, welcoming, things that we can extrapolate into how that might shape immigration policy. But first, before you even get to the wonky policy details, it should be Christians saying, you've claimed to really care about Christians. These are the things Christians care about, and we want to be really vocal about it. On a more personal and communal level, I just a couple weeks ago at my church, we had a little mini conference kind of talking about cultural, political issues. There was a pastor there of a primarily immigrant church. This was pre the election, terrified, really scared about what this would mean for him and his community. And it was an opportunity for people to say, okay, this is a church with a pastor in my community. We can both show up and pray and support. We can be there to build relationships so we know what needs they have. That's true of lots of places in the country. Not every part of the U.S. has a church of immigrants that you could find, but a lot of places people live, you could find people who are already doing work, who already have the know-how. again, to Esau's point, you don't have to become an expert in this. But one way that I think we fight against some of the toxicity of our political culture right now is by resisting the urge to say, I want to do something about this issue, and the only avenue I have is to berate people on the internet. Instead, to say there are actual communities that have needs that I can be in relationship with, that I can be humble enough to say, I don't know everything. You're the experts in what you're experiencing. Tell me what you need. Tell me how I can support. I don't want to be the one that needs to be the quote unquote prophetic voice on Twitter telling people how it is. I want to be the person that's a servant responding to your needs.
Kaitlyn, have you been berating people on Twitter again?
No, I try not to. I really try not.
Yeah.
Have you, Phil?
Oh, I would never.
Okay.
I've been berated quite a bit in the last 72 hours, I must say. Hey, everybody, the next couple of years are going to be really interesting, and we want to help you walk through it with one hand on the Bible and the other hand towards our neighbors. I live in a suburb of Chicago that is 55% Latino, so it is going to hit my neighbors pretty heavily. When you sign up for Holy Post Plus, not only do you help us make more content, but you get access to more content that you can't find anywhere else, like weekly episodes of the Skye Pod, Skye's podcast, bi-weekly episodes of Getting Schooled with Kaitlyn Shess, Kaitlyn's little educational thing that she does, bonus interviews with guests, our quarterly book club, fun segments like Sunday School with Kaitlyn Shess. Ooh, hear Kaitlyn teach a Bible story to a couple of kids. That sounds fun. And lots more, a monthly live stream and lots more stuff. So help you, help us, help you. And go to Holy Post Plus. Go to holypost.com, look for Holy Post Plus, and sign up if you want to. Okay, guys, we got a guest coming up. Stay tuned. The next 6 months in particular are going to be interesting. We'll see you next week.
You know that I'm a skeptic. I like things to have evidence, proof, data. I like to research things before I commit to them. And that even goes for my supplements. I want to know that they're high quality. That's why for the last year I've been drinking AG1. Unlike many supplement brands, AG1 conducts relentless testing to set the standard for purity and potency. I know I can trust what's in every scoop of AG1 because it's tested for 950 contaminants and banned substances, while the industry standard typically only tests for 10. AG1's ingredients are also heavily researched for efficacy and quality, and I love that every scoop also includes prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut health. So, if you want to replace your multivitamins and your digestive aids, your immune support into just one simple scoop, start with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 and K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription at drinkag1.com/holypost. That's drinkag1.com/holypost. Go check it out, and thanks to AG1 for sponsoring this episode.
The Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. I'm not super good at people stuff. I like ideas and technology and puppets. When Lisa and I got married, it was a shock to see just how different we approach the world and each other. The thoughtful gift of marriage counseling from one of our parents was a huge help in those early years. Faithful Counseling can help you get through life's rough spots. With more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, Faithful Counseling makes it easy to find a great therapist that'll work for you. You can meet over video or phone sessions, and changing therapists is easy and free until you find the right fit. So don't struggle alone. Let Faithful Counseling match you with a licensed therapist who can help you grow into the best version of yourself. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling you need. And there's a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode.
David French, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Skye, thanks for having me back.
I can't think of anyone else I'd rather talk to right now in the aftermath of this election than you. I know you've been doing a lot of writing and a lot of podcasts about the election. So before we get into the topics I'm interested in, now that it's been a week, what's kind of your takeaway? What's your big headline from this outcome?
Yeah, my big headline is this was an inflation election. That's my big headline. Because if you look at what happened in America, it is exactly what has happened in every developed country in the world since inflation hit. If it was a party in powers on the right, they were punished. If the party in powers on the left, they were punished. This is exactly within that sort of world median of outcomes after inflation hit. And there's a couple of things. It's not just the world median, it's also the demographics of the actual vote itself. So, for example, if you look, for the first time in decades, Democrats won people who made $100,000 or more a year, and Republicans won lower income voters. So all of a sudden you had the voting composition shift in a pretty dramatic way. Well, who is most impacted by inflation? It's lower income voters. They have the least cushion. By some measures, many of these guys are not going to be back at their 2019 purchasing power until 2025. And so this is something, and I think that Harris had hoped that the easing of inflation would have changed hearts and minds more than it did. And because when I say inflation election, a lot of people immediately respond to me and say, what are you talking about? It's 2.5% now. It's low now. Well, it is now. But
right.
In late 2021, moving into 2022, early 2023, that put a lot of people way behind, and they haven't caught up yet. And then there's this other factor, which is interest rates. Now, interest rates had to go up to combat inflation. This is one of the ways you combat inflation. But that makes things more expensive, right? And we still have higher interest rates. So I do think that the inflation element here, that economic element, was really big. And then the other thing that was big, Skye, was, when I think of what elections are about, they usually are boiled down to two things: peace and prosperity. We've touched on the prosperity bit. Peace is an interesting term. It doesn't necessarily just mean, is our nation at war or not? It can mean, do I feel a sense of order? Do I feel a sense of calm? And even though the crime rate had fallen dramatically since 2020, the last year of Trump's term, there was another kind of disorder, and that was the disorder on the border. That first 3 years of Biden's presidency, before he cracked down this year, that was a flood of people. And there's not a good explanation for why that was permitted to happen. And so I think those two things together. And then the last thing I'll say is, look, Biden's approval rating went underwater in the chaotic retreat from Afghanistan and never came back. It never came back from that. So there were big events. And then, the final thing I'll say is, when Biden decided to stay in the race, he really hurt the Democrats. He really hurt the Democrats when he did that. So you change any one of those factors, and it might be a different election.
I agree completely. The Harris campaign obviously was aware that inflation and immigration were going to be massive headwinds against them, as was Biden's approval rating, and that she was the vice president to a very unpopular president. They knew all of that going in. And I think they had a theory of the election that they could emphasize two other issues that might combat those headwinds.
Yeah.
One of them was abortion.
Right.
Obviously, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision. And in the first election following that, in 2022, the midterm election, there was an expectation that there would be a red wave, that the Republican Party would do very well. It didn't. The red wave never came. And the most MAGA candidates in 2022 fared very poorly.
Right.
And there were ballot initiatives all across the country around abortion that did very, very well. So the Harris campaign came in and thought, okay, we need to really, really, really hammer the abortion issue and get more women to the polls. And they felt like Biden wasn't really good on that because he's always been kind of squirmish on abortion, maybe because of his Roman Catholicism. He just wasn't an outspoken advocate for abortion. So Harris came out and really, really hammered that issue. And yet we now know more women voted for Biden in 2020 than voted for Harris in 2024. So what do you think they got wrong on that issue in this election?
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind right away. One is Trump went pro-choice. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this is a big thing. Not enough people have talked about this. It was so funny because when Trump went pro-choice, I was angry about that. Like, this is what I worried would happen. This is what, else was angry about it? A lot of Democrats I know, because they were saying, no, it's not real. It's not real. Because they wanted the issue, right? And they ran on the issue as if Trump was running as Mike Pence. And yeah, Trump's judges that Trump nominated were key in reversing Roe, but Trump ran away from that issue. It was up to the states. And then you had all these state ballot initiatives that kind of proved Trump's point. Look, if you want abortion rights, you can vote for abortion rights, right? And so there was some interesting ideas that perhaps even having the ballot initiatives meant that some people could go and vote for abortion rights and for Trump at the same time by going and voting in their local abortion referendum. So many states, Missouri, Florida, Arizona, many states had these referenda. And so number one is Kamala Harris was running as a pro-choice candidate against a pro-choice candidate. So that blunts a lot of it. The other thing is, inflation is universal. Everybody experiences inflation. Abortion is not universal. It's not every woman considers an abortion. Certainly not every woman supports abortion rights. And so, what you're talking about, it was an issue that, yes, it did make a lot of women angry, some men, a lot of women angry. It did motivate a lot of people to vote in referenda. It did make a difference in 2022. But when you're running up against these other factors that are universal in their sort of application, you begin to see how the issue recedes. And so the exit poll said the economy was maybe 3 times more important to people than abortion rights. Now, one area where Kamala Harris did succeed was she actually did get a bunch of people to vote on democracy. So if you looked at the top 2 issues, it was the economy and democracy. And she won the overwhelming majority of the people who were voting on democracy, and he won the big majority of the people who are voting on the economy.
We'll get to democracy in a minute. Let me just continue on the abortion thing for a little bit. It feels like part of what the Supreme Court did in overturning Roe was they, as everyone says, they gave the issue back to the states. They denationalized the abortion issue. And that seems to have worked because a lot of people went into the voting booth realizing even if you care deeply about abortion rights, electing Kamala Harris wasn't going to restore abortion rights because there's no way she's getting 60 votes in the Senate to do that. She can't appoint enough judges to the Supreme Court in the next term to somehow get that back in place. And so people realize if I want to protect abortion rights, I need to do it on the state level now. I need to elect the right people to the state legislature, or I need to vote for a referendum in my state. And so it's a states issue now, which means it's not going to be the headline issue for a presidential election, which is exactly what I think the court intended, right?
And by the way, that was also, Trump had some political genius here. Like, look, let's just stop talking about Trump as like some dumb guy. He has a political cunning for sure. He has a political acumen. At this point, it's just not debatable. And so by saying, hey, it's a matter for the states, he positioned himself to the right of Harris, but in a way that for his pro-choice supporters, he gave them a lot to hang on. And so one of the, from a pro-life perspective, this post-Dobbs landscape, there has been a good news, bad news. So the good news is, Roe is gone. States now have the opportunity to vote to protect life. And another piece of good news is, one of the theories that I had before Roe was reversed was that this won't be destabilizing. Over time, it will result in a democratic settlement of the issue. I may not like it. I may not like what that democratic settlement is, but we will have one. And I think that theory is being proven true, that we are moving towards a generalized democratic settlement of the issue. That's the good news. The bad news is it's not moving in the direction I want it to move. The Florida pro-life law survived barely. 57% of Floridians voted for the pro-choice amendment, but they needed 60. So yay, question mark. Like, I'm glad
Right.
I'm glad the heartbeat bill survived, but with 43% of the vote, wow, that's tough. And then pro-choice referenda succeeded in Arizona and Missouri and other places. And so there were a couple of bright spots, like in Nebraska, but overall, the losing streak for pro-life positions when it's put to the voters, and the losing record is just overwhelming. And so I'm very curious as to where sort of the pro-life movement goes from here.
Well, it seems like whether both the pro-life movement and the pro-choice movements realize this is no longer a national issue. It's a state's issue. And the pro-life side, it's also no longer a national issue. So Trump and his court has essentially removed this from national politics.
Yeah, it's over. They
which
lost
is remarkable.
on the national level. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the democracy piece, because this was the other, I think, essential piece of the Harris theory of the election. Here's the narrative. Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. He was elected by the Electoral College, but he lost the popular vote. In 2018, his party lost midterm elections. In 2020, Trump lost the election. And in 2022, his party lost the midterms, and the Trumpiest, most MAGA candidates who were election denial, stop the steal people, they lost big time. And I could see why the Democrats in the Harris campaign thought, okay, there is a ceiling to Trump support. And since January 6th, there are a critical mass of Americans who simply will not vote for this guy because he tried to overthrow an election. And Americans care too much about the Constitution and democracy to grow Trump's base of support. So he might be able to rally his previous voters, but he's not going to add to his coalition. That was the theory that I think they went into this with. And in the last couple of weeks of the election, she really hammered on he's a fascist, he's anti-democratic, he's an authoritarian, he tried to overthrow the election, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
He expanded his voting base. A majority of Americans in the popular vote elected him. I have ideas about this I'd love to talk to you about, but I want to start with, what's your take? I know it's inflation, but the fact that inflation in the economy was enough for 51% at least of Americans to say, yeah, we'll put the guy back in office who tried to overthrow the Constitution. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, well, it's also predictable. So if you look at the sweep of history, so let's take this step by step. In one sense, her strategy worked to an extent, and I think it made the loss less cavernous. Because if you look at the underlying fundamental conditions, she's running as the incumbent vice president when the president is sitting around a 38% approval rating, where even though while America is doing better than other countries economically, telling somebody who's struggling to afford things that they afforded easier in 2019 that, hey, it's more expensive in France, isn't the consolation, right? So you have, and then you do have these two scary, dangerous wars going on that were not going on during the Trump administration. So if you look at it through one prism, you think, how is she in this race? But then when you say, how is she in the race? She's in the race because of January 6th and the rule of law. So
yes,
that's what put her in the race. That's the only reason she had a chance.
To keep going with your analogy, though, yes, she had all these headwinds: inflation, the border, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, and a very unpopular president. She had all those headwinds. Trump's headwinds: January 6th, 91 indictments, being found liable for sexual assault. Those were his headwinds. And one way to look at this election is the economic and international and border policy headwinds of Harris were stronger in the American voting public's eyes than the headwinds of being an authoritarian, unconstitutional, undemocratic fascist. And that's what's, I think, striking is those headwinds were not as strong to most voters.
So here's what's fascinating, Skye. So when you talked about those headwinds, all of those headwinds that you listed were personal scandals of Trump. So if I'm sitting here and I'm making $49,000 a year and I'm really struggling, I might say, look, I don't like January 6th. I don't want that to happen again. But it didn't change my life. It doesn't, you know what has changed my life? The inflation. That has changed my life. So January 6th and Trump's indictments and his scandals did not affect their lives directly. But inflation affects their lives. Depending on where they lived, certain cities really struggled with migrant influxes. That affects their lives in ways that January 6th didn't. Now, here's what's interesting, Skye, and this is a quirk of this election. 2020, they gave Trump a pass for that. Because if you look at 2020, crime was out of control. The murder rate was the highest increase of the murder rate in generations, maybe ever. Job losses were catastrophic. There was chaos in American cities. But what's weird, Skye, is in looking back, a critical mass of the American voting public gave Trump a pass for all of that. They looked at that as like a giant mulligan. And they sort of ended his first term with the launch of the pandemic. And they put that like in a separate category. And so it was a very strange thing to sort of say, okay, wait a minute. If you're I totally get it if you're saying Biden in isolation, high inflation,
right,
border. But he's not running against generic Republican. He's running against a Republican who left office with worse unemployment, with worse crime, like with chaos in American streets. And you're voting for that guy again. So that's the twist here. That's the twist that is the quirk here was that American people gave Trump a pass for 2020. They did not give Biden a pass for COVID era inflation. They gave Trump a pass for COVID-era chaos and unemployment. They did not give Biden a pass for COVID inflation.
I think the part I'm struggling with, and I was talking to my colleagues earlier about this, is like back in 2016, when Trump won the first time with 81% of the white evangelical vote.
Yeah.
A lot of us thought, especially within the evangelical subculture, a lot of us thought that there were certain non-negotiables for evangelicals. And character was one of them. And we just thought Trump violates all of these standards of character and decency that we've been championing for 50 years. Certainly they're not going to vote for him, but they did. Because various explanations, he was promoting policies they liked or whatever. They liked it. I think in 2024, there were some of us who thought, well, similar to the way that character was supposed to be a non-negotiable for evangelical voters, there was a sense of, well, basic adherence to the Constitution and democracy is a non-negotiable for American citizens, for American voters. And that was proven to be untrue this time.
Yeah.
So yeah, the majority who really cared about democracy voted for Harris, but there weren't enough of them to stop Donald Trump from being put back into the White House.
You're right.
And
there weren't.
And you mentioned in your most recent opinion piece for the New York Times that Trump got the nomination of the Republican Party because of 17% of the vote.
17 million. 17
million. Sorry, right. 17 million people voted in the Republican primaries for Donald Trump. That's a fraction, a tiny fraction of 350 million Americans, whatever it might be. That's why he became the nominee. So the party didn't stop him and feel like he was unqualified. And then when he was put in front of the American public didn't stop him and say, sorry, we really don't like Harris and Biden, and we really don't like the situation in the economy and internationally, but we're just not going to vote for somebody who tried to overthrow an election and disregard the Constitution. But they did. And I think that's the disturbing part.
Oh, I've been disturbed for 26 years. Okay. And so go back to 1998. So, and I mentioned this in my column, and it's in 1998 when I learned that people have very high tolerance for scandal if they feel like their basic needs are being taken care of politically. They have no tolerance. They have zero tolerance if a person is failing and taking care of sort of their basic needs. And so what that has meant is that America runs far more on the honor system than I ever had realized previously. I had thought previously that, look, the American people check misconduct, okay? The American people check scandal. No, the American people vote their self-interest as a general rule, okay? And my mistake was thinking evangelicals, well, I'll say it this way. American people vote their perceived self-interest, what they, with the information set that they have and their life experience tells them is in their interests. My mistake was in thinking that the evangelical world had a different standard, that it had a higher standard. So my mistake, and the Clinton era reinforced that mistake, because all of these evangelical statements that you can read now about the importance of character in politicians that just are comical, compared to the reality. And so in 98, I became acquainted with the idea that, look, the American people, as long as the American people feel fine about their conditions, they're fine with corrupt politicians. And this is something that should not have taken me until 1998 to figure out. Just a basic cursory glance at American history shows you how much political corruption we've tolerated for a long time. Okay, so that shouldn't have surprised me. But the evangelical part of it, just to quote Beth Moore again, Trump didn't surprise me. We surprised me. That the evangelical public is just like every other American constituency.
Okay, and we could rehash 2016 over and over and over again, but knowing what we now know, whether we're talking about the American voting public in general or just the white evangelical subculture, that they're going to vote their perceived self-interest, and economics tends to override everything else. Isn't it the role of our political leaders, and specifically our political parties, to be a guard against our worst instincts?
Yes.
And yet, there were numerous off-ramps where the Republican Party could have been done with Donald Trump.
Yep.
They could have prevented him from being nominated back in 2015, 2016. They could have impeached him twice. There was that critical moment after January 6th when he was impeached a second time, where the Senate could have voted to ban him from ever holding elected office again. And Mitch McConnell and a number of other cowardly Republicans capitulated. And then there was the chance for the Supreme Court, I know you were big on this, with the 14th Amendment to disqualify Trump for insurrection from being a candidate in this election. So there were numerous opportunities where the political elite, the party leaders, our judges, others could have protected the American public from our own worst instincts. And yet every one of those institutions failed us. And Trump was presented again to the American public, and they said yes. So who's at fault here? Is the question.
I mean, I'm not somebody who believes that the American people are always right. I think the American people basically behaved the way the American people behave. And this is something that the founders recognized. The founders did not have a Pollyannish view about Democratic majorities, which is why we built in so many checks on Democratic majorities. And one of the checks that they wanted, if you remember, was they had this idea that we're not even going to let the Democratic majority select the president. That was, we're going to have, there's going to be an elite control. The Electoral College was supposed to be a deliberative body, not just this rubber stamp, right? So they had real concerns about the American people, probably too many. They were not democratic enough, but they had real concerns about majority rule. And so at all times, there has been a vision in this country that the American system depends, yes, on the people checking the political elite, but it also depends on having a political elite with moral courage.
Right.
If you were going to talk to the founders and you were going to say, we're going to have a democratic country and the political elite are just going to be a total reflection of popular will, they would have said, good Lord, man, what are you talking about? And so, there is a necessity for a virtuous, courageous political elite. We have to have it or the system doesn't work. And we don't have it. And I put this, I wrote a piece before the election because I just hosted an event here at Lipscomb University where I teach with Susan Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower's granddaughter. And he was talking about, and she brought up this fascinating bit of American history, which is even after World War II, while the Korean War was raging, isolationism was starting to come back. And so we had NATO was barely born. Eisenhower was the first commander of NATO. He goes to one of the senators and he asks, are you willing to support NATO? And he said no. And this person was the favorite for the Republican nomination at that time. And so this post-war security consensus that has led to great power peace for all these generations was hanging in the balance in 1952, right after World War II. And so Eisenhower decides, I'm running. And he decides, I'm running as a Republican because America needs two healthy parties. And so here a human being steps up, expends his political capital to restore the Republican Party to health and to safeguard American security. That's what leaders do, okay? You fast forward from 1952 to 2021. So Mitch McConnell has a constitutional role to fill. And that constitutional role is to vote to disqualify a person who's obviously committed high crimes and misdemeanors by any conceivable measure. Mm-hmm. By any conceivable measure, he's committed high crimes and misdemeanors. And Mitch McConnell not only won't vote his own vote, he won't even try, truly, to get this guy convicted. He just punts it all to the American people. Supreme Court punts everything to the American people in spite of plain language in the Constitution to the contrary. That is not the founders' vision of American political leadership. So yeah, the American people are the American people. You can read de Tocqueville and you can see him predicting many of our issues today.
Yes.
Like you can see it, right?
Totally.
And that's going back to early 19th century. The American leader class comes and goes in its quality. And when the American leader class goes in its quality, America suffers. And right now we're in a time period when the American class of political leaders is really not what the founders envisioned or wanted.
Okay, before we wrap up, last thing, looking ahead as Trump is pulling together his government and selecting leaders for his cabinet and other important positions, what are you looking for that will give you some hope that this next Trump administration won't be a disaster? Or what are you looking for that's a red flag? Like, we're in big trouble. Is there some symbolic position or person or appointment that you think would tilt it one way or the other as you look ahead?
So I have a very shorthand method of evaluating. Is it a nominee that any Republican president would select? Or is it a nominee that only Trump would select? So, for example, if you have Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, he would be a contender regardless of the president. So that's what you would call a mainstream or a normie Republican, even though he's, of course, contorted himself to kiss up to Donald Trump. But as a general matter, Marco Rubio is what you would call a mainstream Republican. How many people fit that category versus the category of only in MAGA are you going to see this person? And so that's the shorthand. Now, over time, what you find out is that the mainstream Republicans who join a Trump team either have to become MAGA or they're out. So we saw this movie before in 2017 when we had a lot of very respected mainstream voices. By 2019, most of those people are just gone. So the question is going to be, at the onset of this new administration in 2025, what's the mix going to be? How many Michael Flynn types will there be versus, say, Marco Rubio types? And that's what I'm looking at. How many of these nominees are sort of only Trump type figures versus any Republican?
Well, he's already announced that he will not be asking Mike Pompeo or Nikki Haley to be part of his administration, both of whom had significant roles in the first administration and had been fairly loyal to Trump other than running against him in the primary. But he certainly holds a grudge. Everyone may remember that he famously had a dinner with Mitt Romney where it was expected that he was going to talk to him about being Secretary of State in his first term. And it was basically just a dinner to humiliate Romney. And because Trump never intended, he just wanted, because Romney had been critical of him. In other words, Trump is not a team of rivals kind of president where he's going to bring in. Yeah. And I wonder about that with Rubio, because Rubio and Trump sparred in 2015, 2016. And I don't know if he lets go of those things.
Well, you know, he loves people who bend the knee.
Yeah, that's true.
So think about his VP candidate. His VP VP compared him to Hitler. So you could say whatever you want to say, but if you bend the knee, it's like Westeros, you know. Trump is like Daenerys with the dragon, and you bend the knee or you burn, right? But when you bend the knee, you're on the team. And like that is one thing about MAGA. MAGA has an interesting dynamic because on the one hand, it is ruthless against Republican dissenters. But no matter what you did in the past, no matter what you said, no matter how vociferous you were, if you say, at long last, I've seen the light, and that light looks a lot like Donald Trump, then MAGA is like, come here, big guy. It really does embrace, these people who've changed. There's just no, we've just seen this time and time and time again. And so, but it's a one-way street, man. There's no tolerance. There's no tolerance for any disagreement, any dissent. When you bend the knee, you got to bend that knee. And so that dynamic was not fully known in 2017. It's fully known in 2024.
When you look at the number of bodies under the Trump bus, both prior to him entering politics, certainly after his entrance to politics, when you look at the number of bodies and just the trail of destruction this man leaves behind him, of people who pledged loyalty, who served him faithfully, who had his best interests, just destroy them. I have to question the judgment of anybody who says yes to being a part of his inner circle.
I am absolutely with you, Skye, but ambition's a heck of a thing. And, the bottom line is, I guarantee you that there are folks right now who have bent the knee to Trump and are staring a cabinet position in the face right now, who are staring high level government appointments in the face right now, who are saying, I made the right call, obviously, because look at all those people who didn't bend the knee. Where are they? They're behind the bus. They've got the tire tracks on them. And where am I? I'm in the room where it happens. And this is ambition, man. This is to be in the room where it happens is a powerful ambition, powerful. And then you start to teach yourself and think to yourself that not just is it privilege for me to be in the room where it happens, it's necessary. It's necessary because I alone can fix this, or I alone can be the voice of reason to Trump. I alone can, you start to get that inflated sense of yourself. So that ambition and pride, those things together, it's absolutely makes all the sense in the world. And this is why, this victory is it's one of the reasons why you're seeing so much triumphalism online, is because a lot of these folks made this calculation that this is their path to influence. And it was teetering in the balance, and they won. And now they have an enormous amount of influence, enormous amount of power. And a lot of them are pretty unlikely people. They're people that never would have a lot of influence or power in a normal Republican administration. But because they stuck with Trump, because they had the foresight to see that Trump was going places, they have access that in any other circumstance they never would. And so that level of loyalty is just extreme in those circumstances.
Well, I appreciate your insight and the attention on what kind of people does he nominate. Are these normie Republicans that would be in any other Republican administration, or are these
only
MAGA
Trumpers?
Loyalists? Only Trumpers. Well, we'll keep an eye on that. David, thank you for your insights, for your writing. We are going to obviously stay in touch over the coming weeks and months, years, as this new era unfolds and we see what we're in for.
Yeah. Thanks, Skye. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.